For 4 centuries, the cross had been in retreat. From the sands of Syria to the shores of Iberia, the banners of Christ had fallen, one by one. Alexandria, Carthage, Jerusalem, names once holy in Christendom, now spoken in lament. Along the seas of the south, piracy ruled the horizon. From the 8th century onward, corsairs struck like thunder across the Mediterranean, seizing ships, plundering ports, and vanishing with gold, grain, and lives alike. Merchant fleets were stripped bare, churches along the coasts looted of chalices and relics, and the ransom of nations melted into the treasuries of Tunis and Algiers. By some reckonings, the wealth stolen from Christendom's shores before the age of the Crusades rivaled the revenues of kings. But the sea was only the beginning. From the fall of Iberia in 711 to the sack of Rome's suburbs in 846, Muslim raiders carried their wars deep into the land. Villages vanished into silence, their people bound in chains for African markets. The slow attrition of centuries without a single decisive battle. By the 11th century, perhaps 250,000 Christians had been taken into bondage, and likely far more, for few kingdoms yet counted the souls they lost. By the late 11th century, Christendom felt itself encircled, its coastlines burned, its pilgrims enslaved, its merchants ruined. And then came the final shock. In the east, the empire that had once guarded Europe's frontier was broken at Manzikert. Its emperor sent pleas across the continent. If the West does not come, Constantinople will fall. To many who heard the call of Urban II at Clermont, the road to Jerusalem began not in the east, but on their own ravaged shores. And yet, Europe still quarreled with itself. Kings fought kings, knights turned their swords upon their kin, while the frontier crept ever closer. A sense grew, slow, grim, undeniable, that Christendom was cornered. To many, the question was no longer whether to fight, but when the fighting would reach their own gates. When the call finally came in 1095, it did not sound like ambition. It sounded like deliverance. Not conquest, but rescue. Not a war of expansion, but the defense of a faith surrounded on every side. For those who took the cross, the crusade was not a march of aggression. It was the rallying of a civilization that feared extinction. A spark that would ignite a fire. A war not only of faith or defense, but of civilization itself. A struggle in which salvation and survival became indistinguishable, and the sword was lifted not merely for God, but for the world believed to be his. Long before the first crusader took the cross, Christendom had been at war, not by choice, but by endurance. In the 7th century, the armies of Islam erupted from Arabia with astonishing speed. Within a single lifetime, they swept through the ancient Christian heartlands. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, lands that had spoken the name of Christ for 600 years. The patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem fell in turn. By the 8th century, North Africa was gone, its churches silenced beneath new minarets. From those conquered shores came a new kind of warfare. Corsairs raided the Mediterranean coastlines, burning towns, seizing villagers, enslaving thousands. In Italy, in Provence, in the islands of the Tyrrhenian Sea, captives vanished into the slave markets of Tunis and Algiers. No fisherman, no merchant, no pilgrim could sail without fear of the crescent flag. Spain, too, was overrun. In 711, the Visigothic kingdom was shattered. Within a decade, the banners of Islam stood north of the Pyrenees. Only a handful of mountain redoubts in Asturias held out, beginning what would become the Reconquista, a war that would last 800 years. In the east, Byzantium fought alone. Its armies, once the shield of Christendom, were broken by the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert in 1071. The empire's provinces collapsed. Anatolia, the granary of the east, was lost. The great city of Constantinople stood suddenly exposed. For Western Europe, the picture was unmistakable. From the Atlantic to the Bosporus, the Christian world had been driven back. Its trade routes strangled, its coasts plundered, its holy places held by others. 4 centuries of loss had carved a single conviction into the minds of its people, that the faith was under siege. By the end of the 11th century, Christendom was weary, divided, but not yet broken. When word came from the emperor in Constantinople, a plea for aid against the Turk, the call struck deep into an old wound. The West did not hear a summons to conquest. It heard the echo of centuries of invasion, and the first clear chance to strike back. In November of the year 1095, the princes and prelates of France gathered in the small town of Clermont. Among them stood Pope Urban II, a man shaped by the ruins of Christendom he had inherited. News from the east had grown dire. Byzantium was crumbling under Turkish pressure, its emperor begging the West for soldiers. The pilgrim roads to Jerusalem had become gauntlets of danger. Beaten travelers returned with tales of humiliation, robbery, and death. And in the West, the nobility, restless and warlike, spilled their strength on feuds that served no purpose but pride. Urban saw in this chaos both peril and possibility. If Christian arms could be turned outward, not against each other, but against a common threat, Christendom might yet be healed through war. When he rose to speak, chroniclers say his words struck like thunder. He called upon knights and peasants alike to take up the cross, to defend the Eastern Christians, to free the Holy Sepulchre, and to win absolution through sacrifice. He spoke of pilgrims struck down, of holy places defiled, of brothers in the East calling for aid. And then he offered something no pope had ever offered before, not merely blessing, but redemption. Those who fought and died in this cause would have their sins forgiven. His message spread like fire across Europe. Nobles stitched crosses to their cloaks. Villages wept as fathers, sons, and brothers took vows of departure. It was not greed that stirred them. Few expected wealth from the barren East, but the promise of penance, the defense of faith, and the dream of reclaiming what had been lost for generations. When the first Crusaders marched in 1096, they believed they were not waging holy war, but answering holy need. To rescue, to protect, to atone. The sword for once was turned outward, and for the first time in centuries, Christendom moved to take back the ground it had lost. The First Crusade began as a response to a genuine plea for help. In 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos of Byzantium sent envoys to the west, warning that the Seljuk Turks, after their crushing victory at Manzikert in 1071, had seized most of Anatolia and now threatened Constantinople itself. Pope Urban II answered that call at the Council of Clermont, urging the warriors of Christendom to defend their eastern brethren, protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, and recover the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusade was declared not as a campaign of conquest, but as a penitential act, a chance to redeem sin through the defense of the faith. Between 60,000 and 70,000 people took the cross, including around 7,000 knights and 35,000 infantry. Among them were some of the most prominent lords of Europe: Raymond IV of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, and Hugh of Vermandois. Many were veterans of decades of internal European warfare. Men now offered a holier battlefield. Alongside them came thousands of peasants and minor clergy, inspired by the preacher Peter the Hermit. His untrained mob, known as the People's Crusade, was annihilated in Asia Minor before the main army even arrived. The organized forces reached Constantinople in early 1097. They crossed into Asia under Byzantine guidance and quickly won two major victories: the Siege of Nicaea, which they returned to imperial control, and the Battle of Dorylaeum, where roughly 25,000 Crusaders repelled an estimated 30,000 Seljuk troops under Kilij Arslan I. These early triumphs convinced many that divine favor was with them. Yet what followed tested every conviction they held. At Antioch, the Crusaders endured an 8-month siege, marked by starvation, desertion, and disease. When they finally took the city in June 1098, largely thanks to treachery within the walls, they were immediately besieged in turn by a massive Muslim relief army. Morale broke until the reported discovery of the Holy Lance, the spear said to have pierced Christ's side, reignited their resolve. The Crusaders fought their way out and triumphed against overwhelming odds, interpreting survival itself as a miracle. In the aftermath of victory came something Europe had not seen for centuries: Christian expansion into the east. The Crusaders established 4 principalities: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. each serving as a defensive frontier of Latin Christendom. These were not colonies of greed, but military outposts meant to protect pilgrims, trade routes, and the Holy Land itself. For the first time since the fall of the ancient world, the tide had turned in Christendom's favor. In the summer of 1099, roughly 12,000 survivors, including fewer than 1,500 knights, reached Jerusalem. The city, then held by the Fatimid Egyptians, fell after a bloody 5-week siege on July 15th. Contemporary chroniclers describe weeping soldiers dropping to their knees at the Holy Sepulchre, thanking God for what they believed was deliverance, not conquest. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, calling himself instead advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, ruling in humility under Christ's sovereignty. The First Crusade shocked the world. Against impossible odds, an ill-supplied army of penitents had seized Jerusalem and carved out 4 Christian realms in the east. To its participants and supporters, it was proof that Christendom's cause was just, that after 4 centuries of retreat, the faith could finally stand in defense and prevail. 48 years after the capture of Jerusalem, Christendom's triumph began to fracture. In 1144, the county of Edessa, the oldest and most exposed of the Crusader states, fell to the Muslim commander Imad ad-Din Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. The loss was a shock to Europe. Edessa had been the first Crusader foothold east of the Euphrates and the northern shield of the Holy Land. Its fall revealed what many had feared for decades, that the Christian settlements carved out after 1099 were isolated, fragile, and always one strong enemy away from destruction. Pope Eugenius III, elected barely a year earlier, saw the collapse of Edessa as a call to arms. In December 1145, he issued the bull Quantum Praedecessores, urging a new crusade to defend the remnants of the Holy Land and restore what had been lost. To spread the message, he turned to his former abbot and mentor, Bernard of Clairvaux, the most celebrated preacher of his time. Bernard's words rekindled the spirit of Clermont. "Take up the sign of the cross, for God wills it." His appeals drew vast crowds in France and the German lands, where people wept openly, and nobles cut locks of hair to offer as vows. This time kings themselves answered. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took the cross, marking the first crusade led by reigning monarchs. By 1147, 2 massive armies were on the move, numbering together between 60,000 and 70,000 men, roughly 15,000 knights, 20,000 mounted sergeants, and tens of thousands of infantry and camp followers. The Germans departed first, marching through Byzantine lands toward Anatolia, followed by the French several weeks later. But the routes were long, the terrain hostile, and Byzantine cooperation uncertain. Conrad's army was ambushed and destroyed by the Seljuk Turks near Dorylaeum, the same ground where the first Crusaders had triumphed half a century earlier. Louis's army suffered the same fate of hunger, disease, and harassment on the road to Antioch. By the time the remnants reached the Holy Land in 1148, both forces were weakened and demoralized. The leaders turned their hopes toward Damascus, whose capture might secure Syria and stabilize the Crusader frontier. In July 1148, about 50,000 men surrounded the city. Within 4 days, disorganization, shortages, and internal rivalries forced them into retreat. The crusade collapsed without a single victory. The Second Crusade closed in 1149, with no land gained and the Holy Land more vulnerable than before. But its failure left behind a lesson that would shape every campaign to come: that Christendom's defense required unity, planning, and faith equal to its cause. And when Jerusalem itself fell less than 40 years later, the cry for a new crusade would rise not from triumph, but from grief. 40 years after the failure of the Second Crusade, disaster struck the Holy Land once more. In 1187, the Muslim Sultan Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, united Egypt and Syria under his rule and delivered a crushing blow to the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin. On July 4th, the Christian host, numbering around 20,000, was surrounded and annihilated near the Sea of Galilee. The true cross, carried into battle as a sacred relic, was captured. King Guy of Jerusalem and most of his nobles were taken prisoner. Within months, nearly every Crusader stronghold in the Levant fell, including Jerusalem itself, surrendered to Saladin on October 2nd, 1187. The loss of the Holy City stunned Europe. No event since the fall of Rome had seemed so catastrophic. Preachers declared that Christendom itself was bleeding, and Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling for immediate aid to the east. The cause spread quickly across the continent. This was not an expedition of ambition, but one of rescue and redemption. To reclaim the city where Christ had died and risen, and to avenge the slaughtered defenders of Hattin. 3 monarchs took up the cross, the greatest rulers of their age. Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England. Their combined prestige made the Third Crusade the most formidable mobilization yet. Altogether, an estimated 100,000 men joined the campaign, perhaps 15,000 knights and mounted sergeants, supported by fleets and supply trains on a scale never before seen in crusading warfare. Frederick Barbarossa led his army overland through the Balkans and Anatolia, but in June 1190, he drowned crossing the Salef River in Cilicia. His death shattered German morale, and most of his force disbanded. The French and English continued by sea, arriving separately in the Levant. Richard's fleet captured Cyprus in 1191, securing a vital supply base that would serve crusaders for centuries. The remaining allied armies converged on the city of Acre, besieged by Saladin's forces. After nearly 2 years of brutal combat, Acre fell in July 1191, a rare victory that restored some measure of hope to Christendom. Despite the triumph at Acre, the road to Jerusalem remained fraught. Disease, exhaustion, and quarrels between the kings undermined unity. Philip returned to France, leaving Richard to lead the remaining forces. He defeated Saladin's armies at Arsuf and Jaffa, proving his brilliance as a commander, but never reached Jerusalem. Twice the Crusader host approached the city, and twice Richard turned back, fearing that to capture it without securing the countryside would only invite its loss again. The Third Crusade ended in 1192, with a negotiated truce between Richard and Saladin. The treaty guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe access to Jerusalem, and preserved a narrow coastal kingdom centered on Acre. It was not the glorious recovery Europe had hoped for, but it was salvation of a kind, the survival of a Christian presence in the East, and the reopening of the Holy City to worshippers. To those who fought, the campaign remained a war of defense and redemption. Chroniclers such as Richard of Devizes, in his Chronicon de Rebus Gestis Ricardi Primi, and the anonymous author of the Crusade and Death of Richard I, praised him as Miles Christi, a knight of Christ. One chronicler wrote that Richard bore the heart of a lion and the faith of a priest, fighting not for gain but for God's cause alone. In their pages he became the Lionheart of God, the living ideal of the crusading age. Though Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, the Third Crusade restored Christendom's pride, stabilized its frontier, and proved once again that the crusading spirit, the duty to defend what was sacred, could endure defeat and rise renewed. Just 10 years after the truce between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, Christendom prepared for another campaign. In 1202, less than a generation after the Third Crusade, Pope Innocent III, young, brilliant, and fiercely reform-minded, called for a new effort to recover Jerusalem. The Holy Land was still in Muslim hands, and the fragile Christian coastal states survived only by diplomacy. Innocent envisioned a disciplined, papally directed crusade that would strike at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, thereby securing the path back to the Holy City. At first, his call seemed to revive the spirit of Clermont. Nobles from northern France, Flanders, and Italy took the cross, including Boniface of Montferrat, Baldwin of Flanders, and Louis of Blois. Altogether, around 30,000 men pledged to join, perhaps 4,000 knights, 8,000 sergeants, and tens of thousands of sailors, pilgrims, and attendants. But the expedition lacked one crucial thing: ships. To reach the east, the Crusaders struck a transport deal with the Maritime Republic of Venice, agreeing to pay 85,000 silver marks for a fleet capable of carrying them and their horses across the Mediterranean. When the Crusaders assembled in Venice in the summer of 1202, far fewer men arrived than expected. They could pay only half the agreed sum. To recover its losses, the Venetian Doge, Enrico Dandolo, a shrewd statesman in his 90s, proposed an alternative: The Crusaders would assist Venice in capturing the rebellious Christian city of Zara, now Zadar, Croatia. Despite Pope Innocent's prohibition against attacking fellow Christians, the desperate army agreed. Zara fell in November 1202, and the Crusades' moral foundation began to crumble. Innocent excommunicated the entire host, though later absolved many to keep the mission alive. From there, the enterprise spiraled further from its original aim. A Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, offered the Crusaders vast rewards and military support if they would help him reclaim the imperial throne from his uncle in Constantinople. The proposition seemed both profitable and strategic. Restore a friendly emperor, unite Christendom, and then march on the Muslims together. In 1203, the Crusaders accepted. They sailed to Constantinople, not as enemies but as supposed liberators. The first assault succeeded. Alexios IV was crowned co-emperor and promised payment and aid for the crusade. But the Byzantine treasury was empty, and his rule soon provoked rebellion. In January 1204, the young emperor was deposed and murdered, leaving the Crusaders stranded before the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world, owed vast sums, and surrounded by hostility. What followed became one of the darkest moments in medieval Christendom. In April 1204, the Crusaders stormed Constantinople. The city was sacked for 3 days, its palaces looted, churches desecrated, relics scattered across Europe. The Hagia Sophia was plundered, and even the altar of its great dome was torn apart for gold. The sack horrified the Christian world. The Crusaders established a short-lived Latin empire in its place, ruled by Baldwin of Flanders. But the spiritual cost was irreparable. To its leaders, the Fourth Crusade had been justified as necessity, repayment of debts, restoration of unity, and enforcement of broken promises. But to history, it stood as a betrayal. The army that had sworn to defend Christendom instead destroyed its greatest city. Even Innocent III, who had once dreamed of a purified holy war, mourned the outcome as tragedy. The Fourth Crusade marked a turning point. For the first time, a campaign launched in the name of defense brought ruin not to Islam, but to Christendom itself. The vision of a united Christian world shattered, and in its place, mistrust and division took root, from which East and West would never fully recover. Only 5 years after the sack of Constantinople, Christendom faced a new threat, not from foreign armies, but from within its own borders. Around 1209, Pope Innocent III called another crusade, this time not to the Holy Land, but to southern France. The target was not Islam, but heresy. In the wealthy and independent region of Languedoc, a dualist Christian sect known as the Cathars, or Albigensians, after the town of Albi, had grown rapidly during the 12th century. The Cathars were not reformers, but heretics in the truest sense, a faith utterly opposed to the church they defied. They taught that two powers ruled the cosmos, one good and spiritual, the other evil and material. Where Christendom saw creation as God's work, they saw it as a prison forged by darkness. They denied the incarnation, the sacraments, and the cross itself, claiming that Christ had never truly taken flesh. To them, the body was corruption, the world a lie, and salvation meant release from matter, not its redemption. Such beliefs left no ground for reconciliation, no shared creed, no common truth. Between the Church and the Cathars stretched a gulf that faith could not bridge, a struggle not of doctrine, but of worlds. To Rome, this was more than theological error. It was rebellion. Heresy was seen as infection, a spiritual invasion threatening the soul of Christendom itself. For years, papal legates tried to reconcile or suppress the movement through debate and diplomacy. But when the papal envoy Pierre de Castelnau was murdered in 1208, allegedly by a supporter of Raymond VI of Toulouse, Innocent declared that patience had ended. He offered indulgences, remission of sins, and the privileges of a Holy Land crusader to any knight willing to fight against the heretics of the South. Thus began a war within Europe, a crusade waged in the name of purity and internal defense. The campaign opened in 1209, with approximately 20,000 crusaders drawn from across northern France, Burgundy, and the Rhineland, led by the papal legate Arnaud Amaury and Simon de Montfort. Their first target, Béziers, refused to surrender its Cathar population. When the town was stormed, all were put to the sword, a massacre that became infamous for Amori's alleged command.
Kill them all. God will know his own.
From Béziers, the Crusaders advanced on Carcassonne, capturing it within weeks and forcing the surrender of its ruler, Raymond Roger Trencavel. Over the next 2 decades, warfare spread across Languedoc. Simon de Montfort established himself as the champion of the Crusade, conquering much of the region and redistributing lands to northern lords loyal to the papacy. The fighting was fierce and protracted, blending religious zeal with political ambition. When de Montfort was killed in 1218 during the siege of Toulouse, the Crusade lost its most capable commander. But papal determination did not fade. In 1229, after 20 years of intermittent war, the Treaty of Paris ended the conflict. Raymond VII of Toulouse submitted to royal and papal authority, and the remaining Cathar strongholds were systematically destroyed. The last major Cathar refuge, the fortress of Manzikert, fell in 1244 after a long siege, and more than 200 heretics were burned at the stake. To those who fought it, the Albigensian Crusade was a defensive war, not against enemies of the body, but of the soul. The Church saw it as the protection of Christian unity, the cleansing of heresy that threatened to rot faith from within. For the papacy, it proved that the crusading ideal could be applied anywhere Christendom was endangered, whether by sword or by doctrine. Yet its outcome transformed Europe itself. The war brought the independent South under royal French control, extended papal influence deep into secular affairs, and birthed a new institution of vigilance, the Inquisition, to prevent such heresy from rising again. In the eyes of its architects, the Albigensian Crusade was not expansion, but purification, the defense of the faith's very heart from internal decay. Roughly a decade after the Albigensian Crusade began in France, a new holy campaign was proclaimed, this time to strike at the very center of Muslim power. The Holy Land, though partly secured by truces since the Third Crusade, remained fragile and surrounded. Jerusalem itself had briefly been restored to Christian control through negotiation in 1229, but by the early 13th century, its position was untenable. Pope Innocent III, still envisioning the reconquest of Christ's city, launched the Fifth Crusade in 1213 through the papal bull Quia Maior, declaring that only a united Christendom, acting with discipline and under papal authority, could finally secure the East. The plan differed sharply from earlier expeditions. Rather than march directly on Jerusalem, the Crusaders would attack Egypt, the power base of the Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin, believing that by capturing the Nile Delta, they could force the Muslims to trade Egypt for the Holy Land. Innocent III died in 1216 before seeing his vision realized, but his successor, Honorius III, carried the plan forward. The campaign drew wide participation. Armies from Hungary, Austria, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire joined under the leadership of King Andrew II of Hungary, Duke Leopold VI of Austria, and the papal legate Cardinal Pelagius. The first contingent sailed east in 1217, numbering perhaps 30,000 men, including around 5,000 knights. They gathered at Acre and conducted limited raids into Muslim territory, achieving little. In 1218, a reinforced army launched the main assault on Egypt, targeting the strategic port of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile. The siege lasted 17 months, one of the longest in crusading history. The Crusaders eventually captured the city in November 1219, a triumph that echoed through Europe as a long-awaited turning point. Chroniclers describe Damietta as the gateway to Jerusalem, but success quickly turned to disaster. The leadership was divided. King John of Brienne, the experienced ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, favored negotiation, while Cardinal Pelagius insisted on advancing south to Cairo. In the summer of 1221, the Crusader army, around 20,000 men, marched deep into the Nile Delta, only to be trapped by the flooding river and encircled by Muslim forces under Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew. Surrounded and starving, they were forced to surrender and abandon Damietta. The Crusaders returned home humiliated, their campaign collapsing as swiftly as it had risen. To its participants, however, the Fifth Crusade was not an act of folly but of faith. The Fifth Crusade revealed both the maturity and the limits of papal crusading power. It showed that Christendom could still mobilize enormous resources under one banner, but also that faith alone could not overcome divided command or strategic misjudgment. Within years, a new approach would emerge, one not of conquest, but of diplomacy. 7 years after the failure at Damietta, the burden of the Holy Land's defense passed from the crusading orders to a single man, the Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. He was one of the most educated rulers of his age, fluent in several languages, versed in science and philosophy, and heir to both the German and Sicilian crowns. Yet Frederick's reign was marked by tension with the papacy. Pope Honorius III, and later Gregory IX, had pressed him for years to fulfill his vow to lead a crusade. Frederick delayed repeatedly, citing unrest in his empire and poor conditions for war. When he finally set sail in 1227, illness forced his return to port, an act that Gregory IX denounced as evasion. The Pope excommunicated him, condemning the emperor for breaking his oath to defend the faith. In 1228, despite his excommunication, Frederick II embarked for the east with a modest army of perhaps 3,000 knights and 10,000 infantry. His objective was not battle, but negotiation. The Fifth Crusade's defeat had shown that direct assault could not secure Jerusalem. Diplomacy, Frederick believed, might succeed where arms had failed. In the Levant, he opened secret talks with Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt, the same ruler who had destroyed the Crusader army at Damietta 7 years earlier. The two men, both educated, pragmatic, and weary of endless war, reached an unprecedented agreement. In February 1229, by the Treaty of Jaffa, Al-Kamil peacefully returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control, while retaining Muslim authority over the Temple Mount and the city's outer defenses. It was the only Crusader success achieved without a single battle. On March 18, 1229, Frederick II entered Jerusalem in triumph. Crowned as king in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he placed the crown on his own head. No clergy attended, for his excommunication still stood. To Western chroniclers, it was both victory and scandal. The Holy City restored, but by the hand of a man the Church had cast out. The Sixth Crusade achieved what 2 generations of warfare had failed to accomplish. Jerusalem, lost since Saladin's conquest 42 years earlier, was back under Christian rule. Frederick's treaty secured a 10-year truce and reopened the pilgrim routes long closed to the west. Yet his methods divided Christendom. The Pope denounced the accord as illegitimate, while many knights hailed it as divine proof that peace could defend the faith as surely as the sword. Though the gains would not last, Muslim forces retook Jerusalem in 1244. The Sixth Crusade marked a turning point. It redefined what defensive Christendom could mean. For the first time, diplomacy, pragmatism, and mutual respect achieved what holy war could not. To its contemporaries, it showed that the ideal of the Crusade had matured. No longer just a clash of armies, but a contest for endurance, influence, and faith itself. 2 decades after Emperor Frederick II's peaceful recovery of Jerusalem, the Holy Land once again slipped from Christian hands. In 1244, a coalition of Khwarezmian and Egyptian forces stormed the city, slaughtering its inhabitants and ending Latin rule there for good. The shock reverberated through Europe. To many, it was proof that diplomacy had failed, that only renewed faith and sacrifice could redeem Christendom's losses. Among those who took the vow to restore the Holy City was Louis IX, the young king of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. Deeply devout and known for his austerity, Louis viewed the crusade not as conquest but as an act of penance. He took the cross in 1245, after recovering from a near-fatal illness that he interpreted as divine summons. Under papal blessing, he mobilized one of the largest crusading armies of the century, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers, including about 2,500 knights, and a fleet of more than 120 ships. The campaign, the Seventh Crusade, was directed once again at Egypt, the strategic key to the Holy Land, where the new Ayyubid rulers controlled the routes to Jerusalem. In June 1249, the Crusaders captured Damietta, repeating the first success of the Fifth Crusade. But the familiar pattern of overconfidence and misjudgment soon followed. Louis advanced inland toward Cairo, despite the flooding season and logistical weakness. In February 1250, his army, numbering about 15,000 men, was trapped at Al-Mansura by Muslim forces under the command of the future Sultan Baybars. After fierce street fighting, the Crusaders were cut off and decimated. Louis himself was taken prisoner along with thousands of his men. He was released only after paying a massive ransom of 400,000 livres tournois, a sum equal to nearly half the crown's annual revenue, roughly $500 million in modern terms, and surrendering Damietta. Unlike earlier kings who might have returned home in defeat, Louis remained in the east for 4 more years, governing from Acre and using his resources to rebuild Christian fortifications, negotiate truces, and strengthen trade routes. He believed that even in loss, the duty to defend Christendom endured, not through victory, but through perseverance. In 1254, he finally returned to France, his piety undimmed and his reputation for holiness growing. 16 years later, in 1270, Louis took the cross again. The Eighth Crusade, his final campaign, was aimed at Tunis in North Africa, an attempt to convert the local ruler and establish a new base for future operations in the east. But the expedition was doomed from the start. Disease swept the camp soon after landing, and on August 25, 1270, Louis IX died in his tent, reportedly whispering the words, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." His army withdrew soon after, led home by his brother Charles of Anjou. The twin crusades of Louis IX, one ending in captivity, the other in death, were failures in arms but triumphs in spirit. To his contemporaries, Louis was the model of the Christian king, pure, humble, and unwavering in faith. His canonization in 1297 transformed him into the patron saint of crusaders, the embodiment of sacrifice in defense of the faith. With Louis' death, the age of the Great Crusades effectively ended. The spirit of holy war lingered, but its center of gravity shifted, from the kings and knights of the West to the fortified orders and frontier warriors of the remaining outposts. The dream of retaking Jerusalem faded, yet the conviction that Christendom must defend itself, by sword, by faith, or by martyrdom, endured long after the banners of the cross were lowered. As the Great Crusades to the Holy Land waned, Christendom's war of survival continued. Only now, the front lines had moved closer to home. From the mountains of Asturias to the plains of Andalusia, a campaign of faith and endurance unfolded that would last nearly 8 centuries. History remembers it as the Reconquista, a reconquest of Europe's lost lands, and in many ways, a crusade in all but name. The Reconquista began in 711, when Muslim armies from North Africa, first the Umayyads, then later the Almoravids and Almohads, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom of Spain. Within a decade, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula lay under Muslim rule. Yet in the northern mountains, a few Christian enclaves survived. Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and later Castile and Portugal. For centuries, they fought not to expand, but to endure. Their struggle was framed not as ambition, but as defense, to reclaim what had once been Christendom's, and to drive the invader from European soil. By the late 11th century, the papacy began to recognize this Iberian resistance as part of the same spiritual war being fought in the East. Pope Alexander II granted indulgences to warriors at the siege of Barbastro in 1064, and Pope Urban II, the same pope who launched the First Crusade, extended identical privileges to those fighting in Spain against the Saracens. From that moment onward, the Reconquista became a crusade of its own, not to recover Jerusalem, but to defend Europe itself. Over the following centuries, this campaign gathered momentum. The Christian advance moved steadily southward. Toledo was retaken in 1085 by Alfonso VI of Castile. Lisbon, captured in 1147 with the aid of passing northern crusaders. Córdoba, seized in 1236. Valencia, in 1238. And Seville, in 1248. Each victory was celebrated not merely as conquest, but as liberation, a cleansing of Christendom's frontier. By the mid-13th century, Muslim rule in Iberia had shrunk to a single stronghold, the Nasrid Emirate of Granada. The Reconquista was unlike the Crusades of the East in scope and tempo. It was not a single campaign, but a centuries-long process of attrition, diplomacy, and settlement. Yet it was animated by the same conviction that Christian lands, once taken by the sword, must be reclaimed by it. Popes from the 12th century onward granted full crusading indulgences to Iberian warriors. Knights took the cross, and entire monastic military orders, such as Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcántara, were founded to wage this holy war on European soil. In 1492, after nearly 800 years of struggle, the Reconquista reached its end. The joint armies of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile captured Granada, the last Muslim bastion in Spain, bringing Islamic rule in Western Europe to a close. The victory was celebrated across Christendom as divine vindication, a triumph of faith, endurance, and unity after centuries of siege. Far to the north, another frontier carried on the same crusading impulse. Along the Baltic shores, in Prussia, Livonia, and Estonia, pagan tribes still resisted conversion. Beginning in the early 13th century, the papacy sanctioned a new wave of crusades to Christianize and secure these regions. The Northern Crusades, led by the Sword Brethren and later by the Teutonic Order, itself born in Acre during the Third Crusade, transformed the Baltic frontier into a fortified Christian state. Castles, towns, and bishoprics spread along the coast, defended as the shield of Christendom against pagan and later Orthodox neighbors. By the close of the 15th century, when the banners of the cross rose over Granada and the Teutonic Order faded into history, the world of the Crusades had changed, but its purpose had not. Whether on the plains of Andalusia or the snows of Prussia, the warriors of Christendom still saw themselves as defenders of a faith under siege, heirs to the same call first heard at Clermont. For nearly 4 centuries, Christendom had fought along its borders, in the Holy Land, in Spain, in the Baltic, and at every step its warriors believed their cause to be righteous. But belief alone did not sustain the Crusades. Behind the army stood an entire intellectual and spiritual framework, a theology that made war itself an instrument of penance and defense a sacred duty. The idea that violence could be holy did not begin with the Crusades. It took root in the early writings of St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Augustine argued that war, while tragic, could be just, provided it was waged by legitimate authority, for a moral cause, and with right intention. These ideas survived in canon law and shaped medieval thought for centuries. By the 11th century, when Christendom felt surrounded by enemies both external and internal, this theory of just war was transformed into something new: holy war. Popes such as Gregory VII and Urban II redefined warfare as an act of spiritual service. Urban's call at Clermont in 1095 made clear that those who fought to defend the faith were not merely permitted to fight, they were commanded to. Where earlier Christian thinkers had condemned violence, the age of the Crusades sanctified it under strict conditions: the authority of the Church, the defense of Christendom, and the pursuit of divine justice. At the heart of this transformation was the concept of penitential warfare. The Church taught that sin could be cleansed not only through confession and almsgiving, but through action, through armed service in a cause blessed by God. For knights steeped in bloodshed, the crusade offered redemption without retreating from the life they knew. To take the cross was to transform one's sword from a tool of pride into a weapon of salvation. Canon law soon followed theology. Papal decrees such as Deus Vult, 1095, and Quantum Predecessores, 1145, granted crusaders full indulgence, the remission of all confessed sin. Their families and lands were placed under church protection, debts were suspended, and their property declared inviolate while they served. In this legal and moral structure, the crusader was not a mercenary or adventurer. He was a pilgrim in arms, his march eastward a journey of the soul. This doctrine also framed the Crusades as acts of defensive necessity. The papacy described them as responses to aggression: the rescue of pilgrims, the relief of oppressed Christians, the recovery of lands unjustly seized. The violence they unleashed, though immense, was justified as the restoration of order against chaos. The Crusaders' sword, in this view, did not shed blood for conquest, but for balance. a worldly reflection of divine justice. Over time, this theology became embedded in European identity itself. Preachers like Bernard of Clairvaux, in his treatise In Praise of the New Knighthood, exalted the Crusader orders as pure warriors of faith, men who kill with a pure heart and die to Christ's glory. The knight was no longer merely a servant of kings but of God, his discipline bound not only by chivalry, but by the promise of eternal reward. In the eyes of medieval Europe, this was not hypocrisy but coherence. The same church that taught peace also commanded war, not in contradiction, but in conviction that to defend the faith was to defend the very order of creation. The Crusades, with all their brutality and sacrifice, rested upon this theological foundation, that the salvation of the world might, in desperate times, depend upon the sword. Even in the age of faith, the Crusades were never beyond question. As the armies of Christendom marched under the sign of the cross, a quieter struggle unfolded within the Church itself, a struggle to reconcile the sword with the gospel it claimed to defend. Doubt began early. Chroniclers of the First Crusade recorded the massacres of Jewish communities along the Rhine, atrocities committed by men who claimed to be cleansing Christendom before liberating Jerusalem. Clergy condemned them as sins, warning that zeal without mercy was rebellion against God. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, shock swept Europe. Even Pope Innocent III mourned that
the sword drawn to defend Christ had pierced his own body.
In the schools and cloisters of Europe, theologians tried to make sense of it. Peter Abelard and John of Salisbury questioned whether any war could truly be holy. Thomas Aquinas, writing a century later, upheld Augustine's doctrine of the just war, but demanded strict limits, a rightful cause, legitimate authority, and pure intent. These thinkers drew the moral boundary that would define later centuries, between defense in necessity and aggression disguised as piety. As the Crusader states crumbled and Jerusalem was lost again in 1291, the certainty that God favored the cause began to fade. Each defeat forced believers to ask what had gone wrong, the soldiers, the leaders, or the very idea itself. The dream of holy war survived, but its innocence did not. In the centuries that followed, memory replaced experience. Renaissance humanists treated the Crusades as relics of a credulous past. Enlightenment writers such as Voltaire denounced them as fanaticism in armor. Yet in the 19th century, amid rising nationalism and romantic fascination with knighthood, the image of the Crusader was reborn. Painters, poets, and politicians celebrated him as a symbol of courage and European destiny. The Holy War of Penance became, in imagination, the noble war of civilization. Modern historians divided sharply over what the Crusades truly were. Scholars such as Jonathan Riley Smith, Thomas Madden, and Christopher Tyerman argue that the early expeditions were fundamentally defensive wars, answers to centuries of invasion, not outbreaks of aggression. Others, including Karen Armstrong and Edward Said, see them as precursors to empire, where faith masked the desire for dominance. Both views reveal a truth, that the Crusades cannot be separated from the fears and hopes of the worlds that remember them. That contest of memory has not ended. It has simply changed form. In the digital age, the Crusader has marched again, this time across screens and feeds. On social media, far-right and Christian nationalist movements have appropriated Crusader imagery, helmets, shields, red crosses, to portray themselves as defenders of a besieged West. The ancient cry, Deus Vult, once shouted on medieval battlefields, now appears as hashtags, slogans, and memes. Scholars describe this as the weaponization of the Crusades, the use of medieval myth to legitimize modern intolerance. These online revivals rely on what historians call mutable medievalism, the selective reshaping of the Middle Ages to serve present ideologies. In this mythology, the Crusader is stripped of context and turned into a symbol of cultural purity and righteous aggression. A war once fought as penance becomes in pixels a call to identity and exclusion. The irony is profound. The original Crusaders, for all their violence, believed themselves rescuers of a faith under siege. Today, The digital crusaders of today wield their image to rescue a civilization and a culture, letting faith mostly out of the picture. History becomes a mirror, reflecting not the world of the 12th century, but the anxieties of the 21st. Across 9 centuries, the same argument endures. Was the crusade an act of defense or a failure of mercy? The answer shifts with every age that retells it. From monk to scholar to meme, each generation remakes the crusader in its own image. Proof that the battle for meaning, like the wars themselves, has never truly ended. The Crusades ended centuries ago, but their shadow never lifted. Their banners fell, their kingdoms vanished, yet the idea that faith must be defended, by word, by sword, or by sacrifice, endured long after the last pilgrim knight returned home. In the decades following the fall of Acre in 1291, Christendom turned inward. The great crusading orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, sought new purpose. The Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, then to Malta, transforming into guardians of the Mediterranean against Ottoman fleets. The Teutonic Order turned its gaze northward, waging holy war against pagans along the Baltic frontier. What had begun as the rescue of Jerusalem became a broader vocation, the perpetual defense of Christian Europe. The cost of 2 centuries of holy war left Europe scarred as much as sanctified. By 1300, the combined campaigns to the east had drained an estimated 2 to 3 million lives and consumed fortunes equal to 5 years of royal revenue for the greatest kingdoms of Christendom. France alone spent more than a tenth of its crown income maintaining crusader garrisons and fortresses overseas. The loss of manpower reshaped economies. Entire regions, from Flanders to Tuscany, turned from feudal levies to professional soldiers, while abandoned farmlands reverted to forest. Yet even in defeat, the Crusades had transformed Europe's foundations. The demands of supply and transport gave rise to permanent banking systems in Genoa, Venice, and Florence, the forerunners of modern finance. Shipbuilding, cartography, and navigation advanced under the pressure of war, paving the way for the voyages of the 15th century. And though the treasure spent on holy conquest impoverished kings, it enriched the cities that served them, merchants, armorers, and shipwrights whose prosperity would ignite Europe's first capitalist states. As the Ottoman Empire expanded, that vocation took new form. From the Balkans to Vienna, Europe cast its wars against the Turks as continuations of the crusading spirit. The papacy granted indulgences to soldiers fighting at Lepanto in 1571, just as it once had to knights at Jerusalem. Even in the Reformation, when Christendom split in two, both sides borrowed the language of crusade. Protestants and Catholics alike described their wars as struggles for the soul of Christendom, each seeing themselves as defenders of the true faith against heresy. Beyond the battlefield, the Crusades reshaped Europe's imagination. They fostered new systems of taxation, diplomacy, and record-keeping to fund and organize distant wars. They accelerated trade and cultural exchange, carrying mathematics, medicine, and philosophy from the Islamic world to the Latin West. Yet they also hardened frontiers of faith, drawing a sharper line between Christendom and the world beyond. The same ideal that had inspired unity also taught division, a conviction that righteousness could be measured by opposition. In art and memory, the Crusader became an enduring archetype. Medieval chroniclers turned him into a saintly soldier, Renaissance poets into a tragic hero, Victorian painters into a symbol of honor and sacrifice. Each retelling softened or reshaped the truth, less a record of history than a reflection of what each age sought to believe about itself. Even in the modern world, the echo remains. The notion of defending civilization, of waging a just struggle against existential threat, continues to draw on the imagery of crusade. Political leaders invoke it to rally nations. Movements adopt its symbols to lend their causes a sense of sacred destiny. The word itself, crusade, survives in languages across the West, used to describe every kind of moral campaign, from abolition to reform, stripped of its medieval weight yet carrying its moral charge. The irony is that the original Crusaders would scarcely recognize the world that still bears their mark. They marched for salvation, not ideology; for penance, not propaganda. Yet the legacy they left behind, the union of faith, power, and moral purpose, continues to shape the way the West conceives of struggle and justification. From Jerusalem to Malta, from Lepanto to modern slogans, the Crusades outlived their own age. Their story became a language of identity, of who belongs, who defends, and who must be resisted. And though the swords have long since rusted, the idea that war can be waged in righteousness still casts its long shadow across history. For 200 years, Europe poured its strength eastward, its knights, its coin, its prayers. The Crusades built legends and broke empires, but they also remade the continent that birthed them. From the ruins of holy war rose new currents of trade and learning, drawn along the same routes once trodden by soldiers. Italian ports grew rich, their merchants charting new seas. Bankers learned to move money across oceans as easily as pilgrims had crossed deserts. Even the rivalries of the Crusader kings laid the groundwork for nations. Stronger crowns, clearer borders, and a shared sense of Christian identity that would define Europe for centuries. Yet the same winds that carried profit also carried ruin. By the time of the First Crusade in 1096, as many as 250,000 Europeans had already been enslaved through raids along the Mediterranean, from the fall of Iberia to the sack of Rome's coasts. During the crusading centuries themselves, an estimated 400,000 to 500,000 more Christians were taken captive in wars, reprisals, and piracy across the sea. And after the fall of Granada in 1492, the tide turned to flood. Between 1500 and 1800, North African corsairs enslaved another 1 to 1.25 million Europeans, their ships sweeping from Sicily to Iceland. The Wars of the Cross had not ended. They had merely changed form, from armies of faith to markets of flesh. Economically, the Holy Wars drained Christendom's lifeblood. More than 3 million lives were lost across 2 centuries of crusade, in battle, on pilgrimage, or to disease and famine abroad. France and England together spent the equivalent of 10 years of royal revenue, sustaining distant wars that yielded no kingdom worth their cost. Yet the infrastructure of these wars, ships, fortresses, and the financial systems that supplied them, birthed the modern world. Venice and Genoa, once crusader ports, became empires of commerce. The first standing banks, taxes, and state debts emerged not from peace but from holy conflict. Spiritually, the Crusades halted the Muslim advance into Europe and preserved a Christendom that might otherwise have vanished. But the price of survival was a faith remade in its own armor, pious, militant, and wary of the world beyond its borders. The belief that war could be sacred endured, finding new crusades in every age, against heretics, against pagans, against unbelievers. Europe was never truly united by Jerusalem, but it was transformed by the idea of it. The dream of a common Christian mission survived even as the continent splintered into rival crowns. When the age of discovery dawned, those rivalries turned outward. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the English carried with them the same conviction that had once driven knights eastward, that Europe should never again stand on the defensive, but become the spearhead of Christian expansion. The cross became a banner not of unity but of ambition, sanctifying conquest from the Americas to Africa, a crusading spirit reborn in empire and evangelization. The crucible of the Crusades forged the foundations of Europe's ascent. The same networks built to fund holy war became the arteries of commerce and discovery, linking Genoa to Alexandria, Venice to the Levant, and later, Lisbon to the edge of the world. The sciences, arts, and philosophies once carried home by crusaders and traders ignited the spark of the Renaissance. From that spark rose cathedrals, universities, and empires, a civilization tempered by faith, disciplined by conflict, and destined to lead the world from the 15th century to the dawn of the 20th. Europe, made great through centuries of holy struggle, would one day be undone by its modern reflections. Wars no longer for God, but for man, waged with the same conviction and cost. The men of that age believed they were saving the world, and in their way they did. They preserved a civilization, even as they scarred it. They carried the cross across continents, even as they learned to bear its weight in blood. But in defending heaven, Europe learned how easily it could lose sight of earth, how zeal could preserve faith, yet consume mercy. By 1900, nearly a third of the world lived under Christian European rule, the long shadow of a crusading spirit that had once marched for Jerusalem and now ruled from London, Paris, and Madrid. And long after the swords have rusted, the silence that follows still asks the only question that matters: what was the price of faith?